Hello everyone, this is Gunjan Bagla of Amritt, and today I am speaking with my friend Jessica Kumar, who is all the way in Bihar in northeastern India. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you
Uh,
so much, Gunjanji. I'm really glad to be here.
Now, you and I met in Chicago in 2009, as I recall, and you had already spent
hmm
time working in India at that time. So, tell
hmm
us a little bit about your journey. Uh, how, when was your first time in India? What did you do? And
Mm,
how are you in Bihar now?
sure. I first went to India in 2006 for an internship. It was shortly after I had graduated from college, from business school, and I was working in this very small company, very off the beaten path, outside of a large metropolitan area. I was living in Haridwar, which is a city of about 500,000 people, which of course sounds huge for an American, but that's, as we all that's
Yeah,
that's a very small town in India.
right.
Um, so it was a wonderful experience to be able to learn about the culture and also work in an IT company that was budding at the time. I also had the chance to learn Hindi during that time. It was a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful city to be able to do that. Very traditional city,
Yeah,
a Hindu holy city. So I spent about 4 years there. I was kind of going back and forth for the end portion, which is when I met you, and eventually moved back to the States where I met my now husband, Abhishek, who is from Bihar
yeah,
in northern India. And he and I worked in for quite some time, both in different professions. I primarily worked in marketing,
yes,
and Abhishek has worked in education and technology, both. So we both worked there. And since the time we met, we always had this itch of going back to India was always an option for us as a couple.
yeah,
Obviously, I'm an American. I grew up in the Midwest, but I always had this itch that I felt India was an interesting place to me. I had seen my father, who is an international business person, working primarily when I was growing up. He was primarily working in Korea, China, and some parts of Europe. And I just saw that, and I wanted to do a similar thing.
yeah.
Uh, I don't think they ever realized I would move overseas and learn a whole new language and marry someone from that culture, but that's what happened. In 2016, Abhishek and I got the opportunity to transfer a little bit of our careers and work for a nonprofit organization in Bihar.
Yeah.
It also correlated with some personal things that were happening as well with his family,
Mhm.
and his parents were getting older. And one major part of Indian culture is the familial aspect of it, as
Absolutely.
you very well know, and I don't have to tell you that. But others who are listening, that was a huge motivator for us. And to really consider moving back to India was my husband being the only son and parents being older and just not really adjusting well to visiting the US and Canada
Yeah.
was too difficult. So we realized that we already wanted to go back. We had
Mhm.
children of our own at that time, and we wanted to give them the opportunity to learn about India as well. So we moved back in 2016 to Bihar. So we're going on 5 years now.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Jessica. And so tell us a little bit about, I know that you blog and you have a podcast, the Invisible
Mm-hmm.
India podcast. Uh, so
Mm-hmm.
you're very aware of the two cultures and the bridges and the gaps between them. So I want to ask you a little bit about what you observe in recent years, last 2 or 3 years, perhaps about Americans working with India or traveling to India or dealing with India, you know, what makes you feel, yikes, you could do this differently and it would be much better. Can you give us a few anecdotes or examples?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the major challenges that we as Americans have when we go to any other culture that has a more indirect communication style
Yeah.
is that we don't pick up what's written between the lines. We're very poor at that. And I'm a prime example of this, taken many, many years of unlearning and relearning and still making mistakes all the time. But really looking at what are people saying between the lines? What are the nuances that are occurring here? And really committing yourself to understanding indirect communication. I would say another one would be understanding the diversity of India. Anyone who claims to be an expert or makes very blanket statements about India, India is like this, India is like that, those are bound to be true and untrue, right?
At the same time.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And so understanding there are many, many, many shades in between those two extremes, which are all existing simultaneously.
Right.
I think just being very, very keen to look for nuances, which is not something that we're very well trained to do as Americans. I think we have to really commit ourselves to doing that if we're going to do well in working in India, is really committing to observing and understanding and asking questions about the nuances that we see.
So can you give me an
I don't know if that's
example or
too
two
vague.
of
Sure.
nuances that you have now observed that maybe people who are new to India might not, or how have you sensitized yourself to that?
Sure. I'll give a professional example.
Sure.
Several years ago, I was working on a project with a fellow teammate, and I was also a fresher at the time, what they call in India, when you're just a new.
When you're a newbie.
I had newbie.
Yeah.
And he was also a bit of a newbie, although I was managing the project for this particular client. And I had written an email about, hey, this, this needs to be done, sent the email. Well, especially where I was living, this wasn't a multinational company we were working for. This is a smaller company. People didn't have the training to realize if someone sends you you have to be on your email constantly. It was more of we need to talk about things. We need to have a meeting. You need to come to my desk and you'd say, hey, I just sent you an email. Can you please look it over? We need to do it by tomorrow. Fine. But I just sent the email and assumed that they would read it and it would become a high priority because of the urgency of the request. Well, that didn't happen. So because of my inability to understand what happened, this email had gone unread, the client never got what they wanted. And so I had gone to my colleague the next day, or the day that it was due. I said, well, what's the update on this particular project? He said, what project? And so I proceeded to, I got a little upset. Like, the email I sent you, where's this? Where's that? And of course, this was a main issue that I did. I was very direct about it. And it was in front of all of our other colleagues that were working on that project. Where is this? Why didn't you do this? I thought that I'd sent this to you. So number one was I didn't understand that I needed to speak it out to him and not just send an email and assume. And secondly, I shamed him in front of my other colleagues, which was really a very poor move. I should have dealt with it privately or given him the benefit of the doubt. So actually that guy ended up leaving the company that week due to this issue we had with the client. And he felt so ashamed and so embarrassed that I had said that to him in front of other people. So I think those kind of things, not being too direct and not realizing the shame honor components of the culture were really mistakes that I made. I'm happy to use myself as an example of all the mistakes I've made.
Yeah. I think, people often refer to me as the India expert, and I say, hey, that's only because I've made a lot of mistakes myself and I'm constantly learning. Every time I travel to India with a client, I come back with new learning. I come back with things that I didn't know about the country I was born in the country that I grew up in. And not all of it is because India has changed. Some of it is just because of the diversity and complexity of India that, you really need to be constantly updating yourself on how to be a more effective communicator and how to deal with the culture more effectively. Absolutely. I've lived in the US most of my life, so I'm kind of a mirror image of you in a sense. um,
Sure.
Now, in your role as a podcaster and someone who's watching both cultures, are there public figures you can identify or share with us who appear to understand, Americans or people from outside the US, outside India, who understand the Indian way of working, Indian business a little bit better than others? Can you point us to some examples, perhaps?
Hmm. Well, I don't watch a lot of particularly American media.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that there's two things that I would look for
Hmm.
in someone that would really understand India as a foreigner.
Yeah.
Um, One thing would be, have they lived in India for more? I mean, I don't want to put an arbitrary timeline on it, but trips back and forth just simply aren't enough to really
Yes.
understand the complexities of, what does it mean to have, दूध वाला आता है सुबह सुबह, the milk guy is delivering and आपका bell बजता रहता है सारा दिन, what's that feel like
Yeah.
to
Right.
live here and have your doorbell ringing and deliveries coming and people in the street, going out multiple times a week, every
Yeah.
day to go get your vegetables, and how that impacts the
Right.
family structures and how people run their houses. This is all really important to understand,
Yeah.
even to do business and understand what other people are going through as a day-to-day life and how their lives run. So I would say that's one thing.
Hmm.
Second thing would be, I think a lot of people who are married to Indians can are forced into the understanding the family system.
Right.
Not saying that if you that no one can understand that if you're not married to an Indian, but that is probably what I would say the most critical piece of understanding India is understanding the whole family system of, निभाना अपना पारिवारिक चीजों को निभाना है, संस्कृति निभाना है,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Being
things you need
responsible
to
to the
continue
family
on.
and the
And
duties. Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
So,
would say that is something that helps quite a bit. I don't have specifics of foreigners particularly, although I will share two books that I've really enjoyed
okay.
recently. One is, and I've interviewed both of these people on my show. Craig Storty
Yes.
is Speaking of India. I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Yeah. In fact, he mentions
And
me in one
then,
of his books. Someone pointed out.
mhm,
Yeah.
yes, and Tripti Lahiri. She writes a lot about social issues, and she just recently
Mm.
wrote one, Made in India, MAID, and it talks a lot about the kind of underbelly of just economic happenings and kind of the informal labor market. Very fascinating. It's not necessarily about business, but it's very important, I think, to understand about India. She's not someone I'd call a foreigner. Because she's kind of an international Indian
Right.
person like
Yeah.
yourself who's
Yeah.
lived everywhere.
Yeah.
But the one thing I do want to say is that I find that there is this attraction to foreigners, in kind of like uplifting foreigners' opinions of India, when there are so many Indian origin people like yourself,
Yeah.
who have very deep and meaningful and important understandings. But we like to watch the Michael Wood documentary on BBC, and
Yeah.
he's a fascinating character of who are telling us about India.
Right.
I would love to see more people of Indian origin be recognized for their expertise in different capacities and fields, when talking about India. And that's one of the purposes of my podcast, is to highlight those voices and to highlight those people who are making a difference or doing something different in society. I don't just want to talk about myself and my own experiences. I want to highlight Indians.
Yeah. And there's so much happening now. I mean, when I started my company almost 20 years ago, the interaction between the United States and India was still fairly limited. And today it is so broad based across business, industry, politics, non governmental organizations, you name it. And yet there is this gap that you mentioned. You talked about understanding the family system in India. And it's so important, I think, for even for people who are doing nothing but business in India to understand that their staff in India might sound very much like them during the day, but as soon as they leave the office, their lives are so different from the lives of people living in the United States in terms of family responsibilities, in terms of all of the things that the neighbors expect from them, and just the everyday reality of dealing with
Sure.
India, no matter which city you are in, no
And
matter where in India you live. So I'm so glad you brought up that point, and
sure. Why would someone need off 3 weeks for a wedding?
exactly.
Those small things, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I I remember when I got married and my wife, who had grown up in India, came here. Within 2 weeks, we were going to a wedding, and she was used to Indian weddings, and she took her time to get dressed. And by the time we got to the church, the wedding was over. They'd already left the church because we were 20 minutes late. So, yeah, there's a whole different experience. And I tell people to watch
Oh.
movies such as Monsoon Wedding to understand,
Mm-hmm.
the role of weddings and the role of ceremony and
Mm,
family gatherings and so
mm,
on. Yes. So
mm-hmm.
you've been dealing with this firsthand, and uh, I love your podcasts. I love your blogs and your point of view on this. Um, what else do you think
Thank you.
people should know if they are new to India and they want to expand their engagement with India on some level, whether it's with an Indian university or an Indian company, or they want to come and sell their products to India. You talked about indirect communication. You talked about understanding the family structures. What else do
Mhm.
people need to understand in dealing with India?
Well, I I think that those are two major things that
Yes,
devote. If someone devoted years and years to those two things, I think they would be do quite well.
absolutely.
Just understanding that India is so complex, and when we with Western eyes come to India, when we see the way the media portrays India, we see that even the way that politicians talk about India in some ways, or talked about India, it isn't just a dump hole of poverty.
Right,
And the media likes to sell us this poverty porn,
right,
to get people to donate to things. So I would say giving an active way not to contribute to that, but seeing that these things, massive wealth, multinational companies, extreme wealth, and wealth also in the middle class, and now the digital revolution, this all exists
yeah,
simultaneously.
exactly.
And from Western eyes, this just doesn't make sense to us because we're used to a world that's more evenly developed. Not saying that the US doesn't have its inequalities, it certainly does, but it's nothing like the level of seeing people that have never been to school a day in their life.
Right,
It can't even identify the basic colors, or can't read. They know how to figured out 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 0 on the mobile phone, and that is
exactly.
it. Um, I now living in Bihar, it has blown my mind on several occasions of seeing how the amount of inequality that can exist in some of these places, uh, as far as economic inequality and opportunities to advance or learn or move beyond certain ways of living. And I'm not saying everyone wants to move past an agricultural society and everyone
Right,
should become, go into the digital. Some people have wonderful lives in the
yeah,
village. but having access to medical care, having all these things.
Absolutely.
And then seeing the massive wealth and advancement of those large cities where we have in these urban centers. But for Indians, these things exist simultaneously, and there's not a chasm there.
Yes.
It's just part of life. It's all integrated.
Right.
And so coming to terms with that, I mean, it's taken me years, and I think it will take years more. I still get slapped upside the head sometimes.
Yeah.
But just knowing that that's there, and it's not black or white, it's not this or that, it's kind of all together.
Yeah. Now let me turn to another aspect that I know you've referred to in your, in your work. You moved to India as a white person, and of course, United States is so diverse. We have African Americans, we have, Asian Americans, and given India's own diversity, what would be your advice to somebody who's from a minority community in the United States and has to deal with India or Indians?
Well, I think you're going to get a mixed response in urban centers if you're doing business. Some people will be very open-minded, and some people will stare at you like they've never seen a black person before. Or if you're a white, I would say there's more interest if you're black or white. If you're Filipino, Latinx, from East Asian descent, you're going to have an easier time blending in. There's not going to be this treatment of extreme interest in either negative or positive. I can share a story. I had a friend back, this is in the early years, and she's from Virginia, from the US. She's African American, and we used to do things together. And she had noted a significant difference in the way that she was treated versus the way that her white roommate was treated.
Yeah.
She said that when people would see her roommate, who was a very lovely girl, both are very lovely girls, and people would just stare and gawk at her roommate and look at her like, I want to be her, almost.
Yeah.
And then they would look at her, who's also a beautiful African-American woman, and kind of be like, that's different. Her own words.
Yeah.
People would in public would touch her hair. She had locks, and people would just come up behind her and just grab her hair. And I mean, these things happen, particularly if you're outside of a large urban center where people haven't seen people of African descent before. So not saying that's going to happen in an urban center when you're coming to do business, but people may have misconceptions about you. And I think just coming in, knowing that, and continuing to maintain a professional attitude and recognize that might be there, and it might not be there at all. People may blow you away with their open-mindedness and willingness to understand.
Thank you. One last question, Jessica. So you essentially you moved to India twice. How did India change from the first time to the second time? Because you could see a distinct difference having been gone for a little while.
I think you should write a book on your next book should be on that. Gunjanji. For me personally, living here, it's hard to gauge because I'm such a different person. I'm in a very different phase of life. When I first came, I was single and I was fresh in my career. Now I've been married for 11 years. I have 2 children. I've gone from being Jessica to now Jessica Bhabi, or, Veer ki mummy. It's like, oh, now my identity is just so-and-so's mummy, or, so-and-so's wife, which happens here in a sense. And people might not be as interested in your professional accomplishments as, aap sari kaise pehante ho, aap roti banati ho, aap kaise karti ho, aap ye. So I think for me, it's, some of it hasn't changed much. But I would say, I don't want to be cliche and talk about the digital revolution, but it really has changed everything. India,
Go
of
ahead,
course, I
talk
think you
about
might
it.
even mention this.
Yeah, please.
You might have even mentioned this in your book, Doing Business in India in the 21st Century, how India skipped the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Went from agricultural society to the digital society. And that just leaves a lot of gap between the generations. And we see that every day, just people who have no clue what their kids are doing, what their kids are into. It's a huge misunderstanding between generations, and not knowing how to advise their kids to be a part of the new world and new economy,
Right.
and not knowing how to support them. Like, आपको engineer बनना है या doctor बनना है? It's like, well, we don't have to just become a doctor or engineer. There are so many other options now.
Right.
And there's things of, entrepreneurship and things that you can do. I think that's the one thing that's changed that a lot of people are still not realizing, is the new India has so many new, different, large range of opportunities. And your child's not a failure if they're not a doctor or an engineer. There's so many things you can do. So I would say that's one thing that has changed, that's kind of thrown off the equilibrium of the way things always were.
Right.
And we see a whole workforce of people who have and I don't want to say suffered that, but who are in the midst of that struggle with people in their family who may be living the same way that people were living 300 years ago in 2021, and their kids are working for a multinational company. So there's a lot to straddle there.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for taking time to do this. And we'll have to do another interview a year from now or so.